At 0742 on the cold morning of March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald Blakeslee sat inside the snug cockpit of his P-51B Mustang at Debden Airfield, England, listening to the deep rumble of the Merlin engine vibrating through the frame. He knew he was about to lead a mission the Luftwaffe believed could never happen. Berlin, 560 miles into the heart of Nazi Germany, lay far beyond the range of every American single-engine fighter the Germans had ever faced. Their intelligence officers had insisted this fact for months. Their commanders believed it as absolute truth. Their pilots trained under the assumption that they would never encounter American fighters over the capital of the Reich. For 2 years, they had hunted bomber formations with impunity once the escorts turned back. But today, under the wings of Blakeslee's Mustang, hung 2 strange 108-gallon paper drop tanks that would change the course of the air war. Together with the internal 85-gallon fuselage tank and the wing tanks, the Mustang carried enough fuel to break every rule Germany believed it had mastered. Enough fuel to fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and still come home. The Germans had dismissed such range as a mathematical impossibility. But the math had changed. Blakeslee was only 26, but war had carved years into him. He had started fighting Germans in 1941 with the RAF's Eagle Squadron long before America entered the war. He had flown more than 500 combat missions, more than any American pilot alive. He had watched unescorted B-17s break apart in midair, their crews screaming through shattered intercoms as German fighters ripped into them once escorts turned back due to fuel limits. He had seen too many burning fortresses spiraling down through cloud layers, men leaping from hatches only to freeze or burn or vanish. Today, for the first time, he had the means to stop that slaughter. The reason this mission mattered stretched back months earlier, to August 17, 1943, when Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 crew became one of the first victims of escort range limitations. On that day, the bombers pushed toward Schweinfurt, the beating heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. The P-47 escorts turned back exactly where fuel charts said they must. German controllers watched them peel west before ordering 300 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to attack. Harriman's fortress took cannon fire in the No. 3 engine barely 20 minutes after losing escort protection. Flames tore through the nacelle. More fighters came in from behind, shredding the fuselage until the tail broke away entirely. The bomber tumbled out of formation like a dying animal. 3 men bailed out. The other 7 died. 36 bombers were lost that day. 260 men gone. All of it happened exactly at the invisible line where fighter escort ended. The pattern repeated endlessly. Captain James O'Connor's B-24 went down near Stuttgart weeks later after his P-38 escort turned back. His crew reported 15 to 20 fighters attacking their formation, pleading for help over the radio, but there were no fighters left in range. They were alone, deep inside Germany, and the Luftwaffe tore them to pieces. His bomber rolled, inverted, and plummeted 22,000 feet. No parachutes appeared. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost nearly 200 heavy bombers in 3 months. Crews called it going naked, flying unprotected through skies filled with experienced German pilots who positioned themselves right at the edge of escort range like wolves lurking outside torchlight. The German pilots knew precisely where American fuel limits forced escorts to turn back. They simply waited there. The worst carnage came on October 14th during the second Schweinfurt raid, later called Black Thursday. 60 bombers were obliterated, 600 men lost in a single afternoon. General Henry Hap Arnold ordered deep penetration missions to stop. It was clear now, the bombers could reach Germany, but they could not survive Germany. Without a solution, the daylight bombing campaign, the backbone of America's strategy, would collapse. And without that campaign, The planned invasion of Europe could fail before it began. The P-47 and P-38 could not solve this. Their range was too short. Their engines struggled in the cold. Their turbochargers failed. Their fuel tanks were too small. Britain's Spitfires were magnificent dogfighters but hopelessly short-legged. And so American crews continued flying into Germany knowing they would be abandoned over enemy territory. They watched the Luftwaffe circling above them, waiting for escorts to turn back. They could almost feel the moment the P-47s disappeared behind them. Then the Germans came screaming through their formations with 20mm and 30mm cannon fire that tore bombers apart like tissue. The bomber gunners fired back, but AB-17 had no chance against disciplined German aces who had perfected head-on attacks at closing speeds over 400 miles per hour. Everything changed on December 20th, 1943, when the 354th Fighter Group arrived with a new aircraft, the P-51B Mustang. It had taken a strange path to existence. The British had originally asked North American Aviation to build P-40s under license. Instead, North American offered to design an entirely new fighter from scratch, promising it would be ready in the same time it would take to tool up for the P-40. The British agreed out of desperation, and in an astonishing 117 days, the Mustang prototype was flying. The early versions had Allison engines that wheezed above 15,000 feet, banishing the Mustang to low-altitude reconnaissance. Then, in April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew one of these early Mustangs and instantly saw its untapped potential. The airframe was superb, clean, fast, elegant, but hamstrung by the wrong engine. Harker suggested dropping a Merlin-61 into it. When Britain tested the idea, the transformation was shocking. The Mustang jumped from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at altitude. It climbed faster. It soared higher. It suddenly became one of the best high-altitude fighters in the world. America began mass-producing Merlin-powered Mustangs, and with their enormous internal fuel capacity plus drop tanks, these fighters could fly more than 6 hours, longer than any Allied fighter in Europe. But the P-51B had a flaw that could kill inexperienced pilots. The 85-gallon fuselage tank sat behind the pilot, making the aircraft dangerously unstable when full. Hard turns with a full tank could flip the aircraft uncontrollably. Pilots learned to burn that tank first, but that required constant attention and perfect fuel calculations. One mistake meant ditching over Germany. The 354th took the Mustang into combat in early December and immediately proved it worked. They shot down 8 German fighters over Kiel with no losses. The Mustang could finally go deep into Germany and still fight. General James Doolittle, newly in command of the 8th Air Force, recognized instantly that the future of the air war depended on this aircraft. He needed more Mustangs. He needed them everywhere. And he needed commanders who would push them to their limit. Blakeslee, returning to the 4th Fighter Group in January 1944, demanded P-51's for his unit. His commander, General Kepner, resisted. The transition would take weeks, and time was scarce. Blakeslee insisted his men could be combat-ready in 24 hours. Kepner agreed only on the condition that Blakeslee would be relieved of command if he failed. But Blakeslee's men had flown Spitfires before, and his mechanics knew Merlin engines. They worked non-stop through the night. Some pilots had only 30 minutes of Mustang experience before taking them into combat. On February 28th, the 4th Fighter Group flew its first P-51 mission. Every aircraft returned. Blakeslee had kept his word. By early March, the Mustang was ready for what the Germans said could never happen, a daylight bombing raid on Berlin with fighters escorting all the way in and all the way out. The mission was approved. On March 6, 1944, 48 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group lifted from Debden at maximum gross weight. The lineup of silver Mustangs formed behind Blakeslee, climbing into the cold morning sky before crossing the North Sea toward destiny. They met the bomber stream over the Netherlands, a sprawling ribbon of 600 B-17s and B-24s stretching more than 70 miles long. As they crossed the German border, contrails appeared above them, dozens, then scores of German fighters forming like storm clouds. At 0958, the Germans attacked. 40 or 50 fighters dove toward the bombers, and Blakeslee ordered his men to break into combat. What followed was chaos and violence sculpted into minutes. P-51's twisted into the diving Messerschmitts, guns flashing, engines screaming. Blakeslee's guns jammed after 2 seconds, but he stayed in the fight, forcing Germans into firing lines where his wingmen shredded them. Goodson shot down 2. Gentile blew apart a Messerschmitt at 200 yards. The air was filled with radio calls, warnings, shouts, kill confirmations, panic, triumph. 7 minutes later, the Germans broke off. Not a single bomber in Blakeslee's group had been touched. Over Berlin, the sky erupted in flak. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns filled the air with exploding steel. The bombers dropped their payloads, and from 30,000 feet, Blakeslee watched Berlin burning beneath clouds of smoke. The escorts fought off stragglers on the return route, staying with the bombers until they reached the North Sea. When Blakeslee landed at Debden, he had 20 gallons of fuel left, barely 10 minutes of flight time. But every Mustang returned. Every bomber they escorted survived. In Berlin, Hermann Göring watched the contrails of American fighters over the capital and felt the war slip through his fingers. He had been assured this sight was impossible. He later admitted this was the moment he knew Germany had lost. 2 days later, the Americans returned. This time, the Luftwaffe was ready. They unleashed hundreds of fighters in what became one of the largest air battles in history, Black Monday. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the P-51 escorts held. Berlin was bombed again. And again 2 days later. The Germans could no longer deny reality. American fighters could reach any target in the Reich. On March 8, Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey tore through German formations outside Berlin, using new aggressive tactics. Gentile downed 3 fighters in a single engagement, bringing his tally near 14. Together, they claimed 6 that day, their Mustangs carving through the sky with the grace and lethality of predators finally able to hunt where the enemy once believed itself safe. With every raid, the Luftwaffe lost irreplaceable pilots. Every failure to stop the bombers left another oil plant, another ball-bearing works, another aircraft factory burning. And every time German pilots looked up and saw P-51's, not P-47's, not P-38's, but Mustangs, they understood that the air war had been lost long before the war on the ground would end. The impossible had become routine, and Germany's skies, once its sanctuary, had become its graveyard.